going on, everyone? Welcome back to DiMaggio Discipline. If you're here, it's probably because you care about growth, right? You care about structure, you care about becoming dangerous in your own life in the best way possible. You're not average-minded, you don't want average outcomes, and you're willing to sacrifice comfort for progress. But today, we're not just going to celebrate discipline. We're going to dissect it instead. Because look, discipline is powerful, but anything powerful, if it's misunderstood, can quickly become destructive. And let me say this clearly before we go any further. I do and will always believe that discipline is the most important tool that you can have in your toolbox. It builds the body, it builds the mind, it builds businesses, it builds trust, it builds standards, it builds legacies. But what nobody warns you about is this. The same discipline that builds you can quietly begin to consume you. And if you don't understand that possibility, you can mistake damage for dedication. You can mistake anxiety for ambition. You can mistake self-punishment for high standards. You can mistake obsession for excellence. And that's where this conversation on what I call the dark side of discipline becomes so necessary. Because we live in a culture that only glorifies the highlight reels of discipline. You know, you've heard it, those no days off, lock in, outwork everyone, sleep when you're dead, all those quotes, right? We love to post the 5 a.m. alarms, we love to post the sweat, we love to post the grind, but what we don't post is the guilt for resting, right? We don't post the identity crisis when our productivity drops. We don't post the quiet self-loathing when we fall short of our own impossible standards. We don't post the shadows. So if you've ever felt like your self-worth is fluctuating based on how productive you are in a single day, or that missing one habit feels like a crack in your character, just know you are not doing anything wrong, right? Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with you. You are just experiencing this side of discipline that nobody teaches you how to navigate. And here's a hard truth. Self-improvement, it's not a 75-day challenge. It's not a summer phase, and it's not a seasonal identity. It's a lifelong pursuit. And lifelong pursuits are going to include plateaus. They include regression, they include injury, they include doubt, and they include those days when you show up at 60% instead of 100%. And in certain corners of self-improvement culture, those moments are framed as weakness or as character flaws, as proof that you just don't want it bad enough. But me personally, I reject that entirely, because one of my guiding philosophies in life is this. It's not about the adversity. It's about how you choose to respond and show up in the face of that adversity. But here's what took me some time to understand. Sometimes that adversity, it's not external. Sometimes the adversity is the pressure system you built inside your own head. I've had periods where discipline stopped feeling empowering and it started feeling suffocating, where my mood was just entirely dictated by my output, where I wasn't asking, did I grow? I was asking, did I perform? And that subtle shift, it does change everything, because when discipline becomes your identity instead of your tool, every mistake you make is going to become an existential threat. Every missed rep feels like a moral failure. Every slow day feels like you're falling behind. Every moment of rest feels like weakness. And hear me when I say this, that is not sustainable. So let me give you the thesis of this entire episode. Discipline is meant to sharpen you. It's not meant to strip you of your humanity. If it begins to erode your adaptability, your relationships, your mental clarity, or your sense of self, it's not that discipline itself is bad, it's just that it's misaligned. So today, we're stepping into territory that does not get enough light. We're going to unpack 5 darker elements that often emerge in this disciplined experience. The first one will be toxic discipline and toxic self-improvement culture. The second one will be obsession and perfectionism. The third will be crippling rigidity and the boredom of repetition. The fourth will be social and emotional disconnection. And the fifth will be burnout and how physical and mental exhaustion play their role on this journey. And I'm not telling you all these things to scare you. I'm not telling you them to soften the standard. And I'm definitely not doing it to justify complacency. I'm telling you to equip you with the knowledge and awareness. Because if you are going to live a high standard life, and I know many of you listening intend to do so, you're going to need awareness just as much as you need willpower. Because look, a hammer, it can build a house, but it can also break a window. So the difference is intention, awareness, and control. I'm not here to lower your bar. I'm not here to lower your standards. I am here to make sure that when these shadows show up, and they will, that you don't interpret them as proof that you're failing. You recognize them as friction points in a very serious life. This episode is about sustainable discipline, the kind that lasts decades, the kind that builds you without hollowing you out, the kind that demands sacrifice but not self-destruction. So, if you're ready for a real conversation, not just motivation, not just aesthetics, but depth, then stay with me because we're going to step into the first shadow. So let's talk about now toxic discipline. Now, I want to be very precise with my language here because obviously discipline in itself is not toxic. Discipline is neutral. It's a mechanism, a structure, a tool. But what becomes toxic is the relationship you build with it. Toxic discipline begins the moment that discipline stops being something you use and it starts becoming something that you are. There is a difference between I practice discipline and I am disciplined. And look, I know that might sound subtle, but psychologically it's massive. When discipline becomes your identity, your self-worth becomes fragile. Because identities, typically they feel permanent. When your output fluctuates, and it will, your sense of self is going to fluctuate with it. You don't just feel like you had an off day, you feel like you yourself are off. You don't just miss a workout, you feel like you yourself are slipping as a person. And that's where I believe discipline quietly transforms into self-surveillance. You start tracking everything, optimizing everything, maximizing everything from sleep scores, macros, deep work hours, cold exposure minutes, step counts, revenue targets. And look, tracking in itself is not the problem here. But when your internal dialogue becomes, if I'm not progressing, I'm regressing, that's no longer growth. That's pressure masquerading as purpose. And this is where I believe modern self-improvement culture just adds fuel to that fire. We are surrounded by what is called performance porn. Hyper-curated displays of relentless output. No context, no recovery phases, no setbacks, no trade-offs, just highlight reels of optimization. And if you consume enough of that, your brain starts calibrating normal to unrealistic levels of intensity. And psychologically, this taps into something very powerful that we're all very familiar with, which is social comparison. Your brain evolved to measure your standing in a group. But today, that group, it's global. So you're not comparing yourself to your neighborhood. You're comparing yourself to the top 1% reels of the entire planet, right? And that constant upward comparison, it creates chronic inadequacy. And when inadequacy drives your discipline, it's going to become toxic. So let me define toxic self-improvement and toxic discipline very clearly. It's when your pursuit of growth is fueled more by the fear of not being enough than by a desire to become more capable. It's when your self-worth is directly proportional to your output. It's when rest feels morally wrong. And here's the dangerous part. From the outside, toxic discipline, it looks impressive, right? You're consistent, you're intense, you're structured. People may even praise you for it. But internally, you're anxious, you're rigid. You're never feeling satisfied. You don't feel complete because if your identity depends on performance, you can never afford to drop a performance. And that's exhausting. So let's zoom out for a second, right? Why does this happen? I believe it's because discipline gives you control, right? And what does control feel like? It feels safe. So when you tighten your schedule, you tighten your habits, you tighten your body, you tighten your routine, you feel a sense of power. But sometimes that tightening, it's not about growth. Sometimes it's about managing fear. The fear of falling behind, the fear of mediocrity, the fear of being average, the fear of not mattering. So what do? You push harder. Not because the goal requires you to do it, but because your identity does. And over time, this tool, it kind of becomes the judge. So you might be asking, how do you prevent your discipline from becoming toxic? Let me give you 4 strategies that I use that are very simple, but also very effective. Number 1, separate identity from output. Instead of saying, I am disciplined, shift to, I practice disciplined behaviors. One of those is fixed, one of those is flexible. You want discipline to be a skill you deploy, not a fragile identity that you have to defend. Because skills, they should be allowed to fluctuate without threatening who you are, right? Number 2, audit your fuel source. Ask yourself honestly, am I driven more by curiosity and growth or by fear and inadequacy? Both can push you forward, but only one is sustainable. Growth-based discipline, it feels challenging but energizing. Fear-based discipline, it feels urgent and anxious. If your system runs on anxiety long enough, burnout isn't going to just be a possibility, it's going to be a guarantee. Number 3, redefine progress. Instead of only measuring outcomes, the weight lifted, the money earned, the metrics hit, begin measuring skill acquisition, emotional regulation, adaptability under stress, consistency over long time horizons. Outcome obsession, it compresses your timeline. Process focus, it expands it. And remember what we said earlier. This is a lifelong pursuit. So if you treat every week like a final exam, you're going to collapse under this pressure. Number 4, build an intentional humanity. Schedule your recovery. Schedule your social time. Schedule times for unstructured thought, not as rewards, but as requirements. Because high performers, they train in periods, right? They don't max out every session. Your life should operate the same way. Let me be clear again. This is not permission to be complacent. Complacency is drifting. This is about control. It's about ensuring the system that is meant to elevate you doesn't slowly start punishing you. Because once discipline becomes your entire identity, it sets the stage for the next shadow we need to talk about. Obsession. And how easily obsession can then transform into perfectionism. So let's step into that. We're going to move into something that for me personally is very loud. It's the topics of obsession and perfectionism. Let me start out by saying, if you want to build anything meaningful, whether it's a body, a brand, a skill set, or a reputation, you will definitely need a certain level of obsession, right? Casual effort is not going to create uncommon results. Sustainable success, it requires depth. It requires repetition, focus, and care. And caring deeply about something can often look like obsession. You think about it constantly, you structure your days around it, you analyze it, you refine it. And look, that intensity on its own is not inherently unhealthy. In fact, it's often necessary. But I think the problem begins when obsession quietly shifts from, oh, I care deeply about improving, to, I need this to be perfect. And let me be clear. Perfectionism is not the same as having high standards. Perfectionism is the belief that anything short of flawless is unacceptable. Here's the trap about perfectionistic thinking. If your standard is perfection, you will never experience satisfaction, because a standard of perfection tends to be very static, as opposed to a standard of excellence, which is dynamic, right? Perfection says there is only one correct way and anything else is a failure. And excellence says there is always a better version of me and I am actively pursuing it. Perfection is brittle, right? Excellence, it's adaptive. When obsession merges with perfectionism, I think there's 3 dangerous patterns that show up. Number 1 is chronic self-criticism, right? So nothing you do feels good enough. You hit the goal and immediately you raise the bar. You make progress and you only see the gap. So in episode 0, we talked briefly about dopamine, and that neurochemical is so impactful for almost every level of thinking that we experience. And one of the things it impacts is perfectionism, right? Neurologically, perfectionism is tied to dopamine regulation. When your brain is constantly chasing the next achievement, your reward window shrinks. Satisfaction becomes shorter and shorter. So what do? You adapt upward. What used to feel impressive for you now feels like your baseline. And I think that constant upward adaptation without any type of emotional integration, it's going to create frustration. Number 2, paralysis through over-optimization. Perfectionism doesn't just push you to do more, it pushes you to do it flawlessly. So what do? You overthink, you overplan, you tweak endlessly, and you hesitate to execute unless conditions are ideal. And the ironic part of this is that perfectionism often reduces your output. Imperfect action starts to feel like a threat. Thinking in perfectionistic terms is not only harmful to your mental health, it is also an impediment to your progress. Number 3, identity fragility. We've talked a lot about identity so far, and we're going to talk a lot about it going forward. But if your worth is directly attached to doing something perfectly, any mistake's going to become an identity threat. You're not going to just learn from your failures, you're going to internalize it. And that creates tension, anxiety, and in some cases, avoidance. Here's an important nuance. I'm not sitting here telling you to care less. I'm not sitting here telling you to lower the standard. I'm telling you to aim for excellence, because perfection, that demands flawlessness. And excellence, it demands effort. And if you haven't noticed already, flawlessness, it's incompatible with being human. And this is where I think long-term thinking becomes so essential. This journey, discipline, self-improvement, growth, it's not a 90-day sprint. It's a lifelong pursuit. If you demand perfection from yourself daily for decades, you will either burn out or become chronically dissatisfied. So you might be asking, Nick, how do we manage our obsession without extinguishing it? How do we walk the line, so to speak? I have a tiered framework for you to try, and it's very practical. I do find it useful. Tier 1, cognitive reframes. 1A, measure direction, not distance. Instead of asking yourself, am I where I should be? Ask yourself, am I moving in the right direction? Direction sustains momentum, but distance, it can feel overwhelming. 1B, define minimum effective excellence. So set a daily non-negotiable baseline that represents excellence and not perfection. For example, show up, execute with focus, leave 1 to 2% in the tank, and then reflect briefly. You do not need a perfect day. You need a disciplined one. 1C, separate evaluation from emotion. At the end of the day, evaluate your performance clinically, not morally. Instead of saying, oh, I was lazy, say, my output was lower than my target today. Why was that? Curiosity reduces shame, and shame, it fuels perfectionism. Tier 2, behavioral safeguards. 2A is called time box perfection. So if you tend to over-refine, set limits. So for example, I will revise this for 45 minutes and then I'm shipping it. Execution builds competence, but endless refinement builds anxiety. 2B, deliberate imperfection exposure. Intentionally publish something at 90%. Intentionally leave minor imperfections. This builds psychological flexibility. Your nervous system learns I can survive imperfection, and that matters so much. I think a perfect real-world example of that is episode 0. I wasn't thrilled with the output I put into that, right? I don't think it was my best work. But I kept thinking to myself, if I want to do it perfectly, I'm never going to post it. I sent it, right? I got it out there. And my brain is adjusted now. 2C, scheduled reflection windows. Instead of constantly evaluating yourself throughout the day, choose one structured reflection period. Over monitoring, it increases self-criticism, but structured reflection, it increases strategic improvement. Tier 3, identity stabilization. This is much deeper, right? So remind yourself consistently, your value is not the same as your output. You are a person who practices discipline, not a machine that produces results. When your identity is stable, your standards can be high without being suffocating. And here's something I want to say directly to the listener. If you are obsessed, if you care deeply, you will almost always have a part of you that wants to do it perfectly. That voice, it may never disappear, but the goal here, it's not to eliminate the voice. The goal is to manage it, right? You reduce its volume. You don't let it run the system. Because obsession, when it's regulated, it's going to build mastery. But obsession, when it's fused with perfectionism, it builds chronic dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction over decades, it's a heavy weight to carry. Aim high, push your ceilings, test your limits, but measure yourself by excellence, not by flawlessness. If you demand perfection, you will never feel done. And this journey, yeah, it's not about feeling done. It's about becoming better consistently over time. So now, let's move into another shadow that doesn't get talked about enough. What happens when discipline becomes so structured that you lose adaptability? Let's talk about rigidity and the boredom of repetition. As we all know, discipline requires structure, right? Whether it's routines, systems, standards, repetition, and that's not really an optional part of this journey, right? Because repetition, it wires skill. Repetition builds strength. Repetition creates identity level habits. But here's where this darker shadow side starts to emerge, right? The same structure that creates stability, it can quietly create rigidity. Rigidity feels safe until your life changes. Let's define some examples of what this looks like. Rigidity shows up when you struggle to function outside your routine. A disrupted schedule ruins your entire day, or you can't adjust intensity without feeling weak. You avoid new methods because they are threatening to your current system. You equate deviation with failure. All those examples, right? What started as discipline, it slowly becomes inflexibility. And inflexibility, it's so dangerous because life is generally unpredictable. Travel, it happens. Injuries, they happen. Opportunities, they happen. Loss happens. Unexpected responsibilities are going to come up and happen. So if your system only works in perfect conditions, then it's fragile. Fragility is the opposite of strength. There's something important that's neurologically happening here. When you repeat these behaviors consistently, right? Your brain, it starts to conserve energy by automating them. And look, that's efficient. That's good. But excessive predictability, it reduces cognitive flexibility, which is your brain's ability to adapt to new demands. Long-term success, it requires both consistency and adaptability. Without adaptability, you're going to become dependent on ideal conditions. And ideal conditions, they very rarely exist. So next, I want to talk about this boredom problem. Discipline and repetition is boring, right? Progress, it's not glamorous. Mastery is not exciting every single day. And showing up again and again, that's not going to stimulate you emotionally. Dopamine, that spikes from novelty. But discipline, that thrives on monotony. So what happens? You begin craving stimulation. You question your routine. You start looking for better instead of staying consistent. Not because the system stopped working, but because it stopped being exciting. And if you interpret boredom as a sign that something is wrong, you'll constantly jump systems, which kind of resets your progress. And here's a little reframe. I would say number one, build flexibility into your system. Instead of rigid rules, use adaptable standards. For example, the rigid way of thinking would be, I train at 5 a.m. or the day is ruined. The adaptive way would be, I train daily, timing adjusts to circumstances. So the standard remains. The method is flexing. Strength is maintaining direction despite environmental changes. Number two, minimum viable discipline. On chaotic days, instead of completely abandoning the system entirely, just reduce it. Okay, you can't do the full workout, just do 20 focused minutes. You can't complete a deep work block, do one uninterrupted sprint. This protects identity without demanding perfection. Consistency is more important than intensity over a long timeline. Number three, periodize your intensity. So athletes, they don't max out every session. They cycle their intensity, right? So high output phases, maintenance phases, deload phases, apply that to life. There are seasons to push aggressively, there are seasons to consolidate, and there are seasons to maintain. If you push at 100% year round, your nervous system stays in chronic stress mode. And chronic stress mode, it's going to erode your adaptability. Number four, train discomfort intentionally. Instead of avoiding disruption, practice it. Work out in a different environment. Change your workflow occasionally. Introduce controlled variability, because this is going to strengthen that cognitive flexibility. Your brain's going to learn, I can perform under these changing conditions. And that's where resilience is forged. Number five, redefine what on track means. You are not off track because today looked different. You are off track when you abandon direction. There's a massive difference. The disciplined life is not about rigidity. It's about alignment. So while rigidity says it must look exactly this way, alignment says the goal stays constant, the path can adjust. And the boredom, you're going to outgrow it by understanding it. The reality here is mastery, it's going to be repetitive. That's not a flaw, that's just the design. The more you expose yourself to discomfort and monotony and show up anyway, the more efficient your brain becomes at executing without emotional drama. Eventually, what used to feel like resistance, it'll start to feel normal. That's literally adaptation. If you misinterpret boredom as failure or flexibility as a weakness, you are going to sabotage your long-term progress. Structure, it should support you. It should not imprison you. Let's move into something even heavier. When you pursue a disciplined life seriously, something else can start to shift quietly. Your relationships, your emotional availability, your sense of connection. So now, let's talk about social and emotional disconnection. So this one is heavy, right? And it doesn't get talked about nearly enough, but when you raise your standards, whether it's your habits, your structure, or your focus, your environment doesn't automatically rise with you. That could create distance, not because you're better, not because you're superior, but because your priorities shift. You start going to bed earlier, you start saying no more often, you become more protective of your time, and you spend more hours alone building what you're building. Slowly and subtly, you may begin to feel isolated. This is just one of the quiet costs of discipline. Let's kind of break down how this manifests. Number one, literal isolation, right? You physically remove yourself from certain environments, less partying, less spontaneity, less unstructured social time. And at first, this feels empowering. You're locked in, dude. You're focused. You're ahead. But humans, we're wired for connection. There is strong psychological evidence that perceived social isolation increases stress markers and decreases overall well-being, even amongst high achievers. You can be productive and lonely at the same time. And productivity does not compensate for emotional deprivation. So please be aware of that. Number two, the mirror effect. This one is very subtle. As you grow, you begin to reflect back to others what they are not doing. Your discipline can unintentionally make people uncomfortable, not because you're judging them, but because your behavior highlights contrast. And sometimes that contrast creates tension. And you may notice friends pulling away, jokes about you being too serious, people assuming that you think you're better than them, general resistance when you decline invitation. This can create an internal conflict. You don't want to lose connection, but you also don't want to lower your standard. So you start shrinking parts of yourself to maintain comfort, or you double down and you detach entirely. Neither extreme is healthy here. Number 3, emotional narrowing. When you become hyper-focused on goals, emotions can start to feel inefficient, right? You may begin prioritizing performance over vulnerability. Conversations feel less stimulating if they're not growth-oriented. You struggle to relate to people who don't share your intensity. You kind of default to what's the objective instead of how do you feel. And over time, that can greatly reduce your emotional depth, right? You become sharp, effective, and focused, but you also become less available. And here's the danger. If your entire emotional regulation system becomes productivity-based, what happens when your productivity drops? You don't just lose momentum, you lose stability because connection was never built as a parallel pillar. Number 4, conditional self-worth in relationships. If you tie your value to output, you may subconsciously seek relationships where you are admired for your discipline. Admiration feels safe, but admiration is not intimacy. Intimacy requires being seen beyond your performance, and that can feel threatening if your identity is heavily achievement-based. Let's reframe something clearly. Choosing growth, it's going to create some separation. That's just inevitable. You cannot evolve and expect every relationship to remain identical. But separation does not have to mean disconnection. How do you navigate this without losing yourself or your relationships? Number 1, differentiate isolation from intentional solitude. Solitude, that's chosen, but isolation, that's felt. You're going to need solitude to build, but you must also intentionally schedule connection, not as a distraction, but as maintenance. Relationships are not optional accessories, they are stabilizers. Number 2, communicate standards without arrogance. You don't need to preach. You do not need to convert people. Simply say, this is important to me. Calm certainty is more powerful than intensity. When people understand your why, they're less likely to misinterpret your boundaries. Number 3, keep one environment where you're not the performer. Have at least one space, one person where you are not evaluated by output, where you can be tired, unsure, or human. I think this protects emotional flexibility. You are more than your discipline, even if discipline is a core value of yours. Number 4, practice emotional expansion. High performance narrows your focus. Make it a habit to ask people deeper questions. Listen without fixing. Engage without optimizing. Connection strengthens your resilience, and resilience strengthens your performance. This is not soft. This is strategic. And I think that's because if your entire identity is built on output, like I keep saying, you are one injury, one business dip, one setback away from destabilization. But if you build connection alongside discipline, you create emotional redundancy, and redundancy creates strength. So let me say this clearly. Raising your standard is going to change your social landscape. That's just an honest and real fact of this journey. But you do not have to become cold to become capable. You do not have to sacrifice empathy to gain structure, right? And you also don't have to isolate yourself to stay disciplined. The strongest individuals are not just structured, they are connected. Now, let's step into the final shadow. Because if you ignore everything we just discussed, whether it's toxic discipline, obsession, perfectionism, rigidity, disconnection, it all eventually compounds into one outcome: burnout. Let's talk about exhaustion, physical and mental, and how to prevent discipline from destroying the very system it was meant to strengthen. Now, this part is where everything converges, right? Up to this point, we've talked about a lot of stuff. If all of these things are unmanaged, or any of these things are unmanaged, they all point to this direction: burnout. And look, burnout, it does not announce itself loudly at first. It whispers to you. You feel slightly more irritable. Your sleep quality kind of drops. Your work feels heavier. Motivation requires more focus. And what do? You kind of just assume you need to push harder, so you do that, right? And for a while, your discipline can override your fatigue. But here's the biological reality. Your nervous system is not designed for constant maximal output. Stress is adaptive in cycles. When you apply stress, training, deep work, high pressure, your body and brain, they respond by adapting. But adaptation only occurs with recovery. Without recovery, stress is going to compound, right? Your cortisol remains elevated, your sleep fragments, your decision fatigue increases, emotional regulation weakens, and eventually what used to feel like driven intensity, it starts to feel like emptiness. Let me be clear. Burnout is not laziness. It's accumulated stress without adequate repair. And in high standard individuals, burnout is particularly dangerous because you often don't notice it until your performance drops significantly. Why? Because you've trained yourself so hard to override signals. Tired, push through it. Unmotivated, push through it. Overwhelmed, push through it. And look, that works in the short term, but it fails in the long term. So you might be asking, what does burnout actually look like? And the reality is, it's not always a dramatic collapse, right? Sometimes it's just cynicism about goals you once cared about, or being flat emotionally, or brain fog, or reduced creativity, or avoidance of tasks that you used to attack. It could be increased comparison or subtle resentment toward your own system. You don't feel weak, you feel drained. And if your identity is built on output, this feels terrifying because if you can't produce at your usual level, then who the fuck are you? Sustainable discipline requires stress management, not just stress tolerance. And here's a myth. Real discipline means no breaks or no days off. That narrative, it's so loud, but it's so incomplete. Elite performers in any domain, they periodize, right? Strength athletes, they cycle intensity. Endurance athletes, they deload. Executives take strategic retreats. And high-level thinkers, they schedule white space. Why? Because performance is cyclical. You cannot stay in a peak state indefinitely. Trying to do so, it doesn't prove your toughness, it proves your misunderstanding of human physiology. How do you build sustainable discipline? 1. Schedule recovery before you need it. Don't wait until exhaustion forces you to stop. Proactively plan lower intensity weeks, reduced volume training blocks, creative reset days, tech-free hours, phases where you prioritize your sleep. Recovery should be part of the system, not an emergency response. Number 2, distinguish between resistance and depletion. Not wanting to do something, that's normal resistance. Being neurologically depleted is much different. Resistance, it feels like I don't feel like it. Depletion feels like I cannot even generate energy when I try. So learn that difference, push through your resistance, and respect your depletion. Number 3, protect your sleep aggressively. During sleep, your memory consolidates, your hormones regulate, your emotional intensity resets, and your muscle repairs. Compromising sleep chronically in the name of productivity, that's short-term thinking. You are borrowing from tomorrow's capacity with interest. So, number 4, install maintenance phases, right? I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there are seasons to build, there are seasons to maintain. Maintenance is not regression. Maintenance is consolidation. If you're always chasing expansion, you never integrate gains. Integration creates stability, stability creates longevity, which, like I keep on saying, this is a lifelong pursuit, so you need that longevity. Number 5, redefine winning. Winning is not maximum output at all times. Winning is sustained high performance over decades. And that requires energy management, not just willpower. So let me say something clearly. Discipline, it should increase your capacity, not drain it permanently. If your system constantly leaves you exhausted, irritable, disconnected, and foggy, it's not strong, it's inefficient. Real strength is being able to push hard when needed and pull back strategically without guilt. Because the goal is not to win this week, it's to win your life. And that requires cycles. Stress, recover, adapt, repeat. If you skip recovery, you skip adaptation. And without adaptation, discipline becomes stagnation. So now, let's bring this all together because I know this has been heavy. So let's close it out the right way. Look, I know this episode wasn't a highlight reel. I know it wasn't a hype speech. And I know it wasn't a 10 hacks to dominate your morning. This was depth. And depth, it matters because discipline, it's not aesthetic, it's difficult, right? And I would go as far to define discipline simply as this: the choice to do the hard things that you know are beneficial for you despite not wanting to do them because they require the path of most resistance. That's what it is. But here's what we clarified today. If you pursue discipline blindly, it can turn on you. When discipline becomes identity instead of a tool, it becomes toxic. When obsession mutates into perfectionism, it becomes suffocating. And when structure becomes rigidity, it becomes fragile. When your focus becomes isolation, it becomes lonely. When output ignores recovery, it becomes burnout. And look, none of these mean you're weak. They just mean that you're a human being. And if you are serious about building a high standard life, you cannot afford to be naive about the psychological and physiological realities of this pursuit. Awareness is not softness. Awareness is strategy, because the goal isn't to avoid hardship. The goal is to navigate hardship intelligently. Remember what we said earlier. It's not about the adversity, it's about how you choose to respond and show up in the face of that adversity. And like I mentioned before, sometimes the adversity isn't external. Sometimes it's internal pressure. Sometimes it's your own expectations. Sometimes it's the standard that you built. This disciplined life, it will test you. It will expose you. It will stretch you. But if you build it correctly, with adaptability, recovery, connection, and emotional stability, it will strengthen you instead of hollowing you out. That's what sustainable discipline is. Not this seasonal intensity, not aesthetic productivity, but a calibrated, intentional system that you can maintain for decades. This space, DiMaggio Discipline, it's not about pretending this journey is easy. It's about being honest about what it actually demands. We are building a space of honest, humble, and ambitious learners. And now, to turn to what's next, in episode 2, we're stepping into another force that shapes everything we do: fear. How fear manifests in subtle ways, how it shapes our choices, how it holds us back, and how, when confronted correctly, it can become fuel. Because, just like discipline, fear is powerful. And like I mentioned before, misunderstood power, it almost always creates problems. So before we close this out, if this episode resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your experience. Tell me which of these darker sides you've encountered. Tell me if there's something I didn't cover that impacted your journey. And if you're building alongside me, like, subscribe, follow, whatever platform you're on. Not for numbers, but because we're building momentum here. This has been another episode of DiMaggio Discipline, where we're creating a space for honest growth and ambitious self-mastery. Thank you for showing up. Always remember, SNWL. Sacrifice now, win later. I'll see you in the next one.